What's up, everyone? This is going to be my first ID diary. So I'm going to start with the Florida scrub. I've got a lot of species, so I'm going to try to get through them pretty quickly. And so in this first picture, if you can see on the right, a little dot on that pathway, that's going to be our first species, the gopher tortoise. So this is Mr. Gopher Tortoise. His scientific name is Gophurus polyphemus. He's got these shovel-like forelimbs that have thick scales on them in order to dig their burrows. And a fun fact about the gopher tortoise is that they are a keystone species, and they are the only native Florida tortoise. Moving on to the Fay's prairie clover. The scientific name for this species is Dahlia fayi, and it was pretty easy to identify because of its distinct color, shape, and it is an aggregate fruit, so that's how I tell the difference between that and another type of species. And a fun fact about this is that they are one of only 4 prairie clovers native to Florida. So moving on to the Florida rosemary. Its scientific name is Ceratiola ericoides, and this species I think is very cute. It kind of reminds me of a miniature pine tree, but it's a little shrub with little tiny short needles. And so this species actually is allelopathic, which means it produces these chemicals that negatively impact other species around them, and they tend to dominate in the driest of Florida scrub. So now I've got 2 species here. On the right we have the prickly pear, scientific name Opuntia. It is a very common cactus in the United States, and a lot of people actually use the young ones, strip them of their spines, boil them, and then eat this vegetable called nopalitos. So that was pretty interesting. And another fun fact is that they tend to grow flowers, and the flowers typically bloom during late spring, early summer. So unfortunately I didn't see any flowers this time around, but hopefully next time. And then on the left I've got a bordered plant bug. He was sitting right on top of this prickly pear. His scientific name is Largus cinctus, and he was pretty easy to identify due to his black body and yellow-orangish border around it. And he does prefer dry habitats, so I was not surprised to see him in the Florida scrub. So now I've got the winged sumac. Its scientific name is Rus copulinum. I found this one in only a couple of books. It took a while for me to find it, but eventually I did, and it was pretty easy to differentiate between other species similar because it's got these wings on the rachis. If you look at the zoomed in picture I've added, you can kind of see the wings in between the leaflets. And so there's another species similar to this one called the poison sumac, and that one does not have the wings along the rachis, so I'm glad I didn't run into that one. And a little fun fact about this species is that they can be found all throughout Florida, so hopefully I'll be seeing more of them. Now, this species of dwarf palmetto was actually pretty tough, and I'm still not very confident. I'm not 100% on this one, just because a lot of palmettos just look very similar. They're all very alike, but I've kind of determined that this one is the dwarf palmetto just because it does not have the teeth like the saw palmetto does, and the way that its leaves are arranged. So this one's scientific name is the sable minor, and its leaves were actually used to make thatched roofs, fans, and baskets. And I did get a picture of its fruit early on. So their fruit is supposedly sweet with a bitter aftertaste. So this guy right here was a little difficult to ID just because he looks very similar to another species of woodpecker named the downy woodpecker. And the downy woodpecker tends to be short and stubby, whereas this guy doesn't look so stubby and his beak is a little bit longer than the downies. So I've determined he's a hairy woodpecker. His scientific name is Picoides villosus, and this one that I saw is actually a male because the females don't have that red occipital patch on their head. And a little fun fact is that their flight patterns is undulating, so they go in this roller coaster up and down kind of motion when they fly. So this species is the Evans reindeer moss, or the Cladonia evansii, and it's got some very distinct branching going on, very thin branches as well. It's kind of in this puffball shaped round form in my eyes, so it's kind of how I distinguished it from other types of moss. Fun fact, the name reindeer lichen or reindeer moss comes from reindeer, moose, and caribou eating them for extra carbohydrates. This is the rusty staggerbush, or Lionia ferruginea, and this one was pretty tough to ID just because it does look similar to other species. However, you can tell that is the rusty staggerbush because the newer leaves growing atop of it are this orangish rusty color, and its leaves are distinct. They kind of curl over, and if you look at the bark, it's got this long, lengthy ridge pattern going on, which is pretty distinct from other types of tree bark. So that is how I ID'd this guy. And a little fun fact about him is that they typically bloom in spring, and they bloom these white bell-shaped flowers called Lionias. And so I would really love to come back in the springtime and see these little Lionias blooming. So this one I'm still a bit unsure about. The Yopon holly and the winterberry holly are very similar, except the winterberry holly doesn't typically occur in these areas very often. So I've decided to go with the Yopon holly. Its scientific name is Ilex vomitoria. And a fun fact about this one is that American Indians would make it into tea, and they would drink this tea for during ceremonies, and then they would vomit the tea back up, and that's why it's called vomitoria. So this is one of my favorite species that I ID'd, the eastern amberwing, or the Parathemis tenera. I actually saw two different dragonflies that are both the same species. So the male on the left, you can tell because his wings are more of an amber colored, whereas the female's wings are typically more clear and have a blotched pattern. So I thought these were really beautiful species. And fun fact about them, their abdomen, it's very pretty, but it is used to encourage predators to stay away. Now I've got the Florida scrub jay. Scientific name is Aphelocoma coerulescens. And so this species is very clear to identify. It's got sky blue feathers and a smoky gray body. And this bird is endemic to Florida and specifically restricted to scrub habitats. They are a fire-dependent species, and another fun fact is they cache their food. So when winter time, when their trees and everything die or don't produce the acorns that they need to eat, they'll stock up and bury their acorns in the fall so that during the winter time they'll have food for later. That is it for the Florida scrub, and now I get to move on to the pine flatwoods. So my first species from the pine flatwoods is going to be this Ludwigia maritima, or seaside primrose willow. This one was probably one of my favorites to find. I think it's a very beautiful flowering plant. It was easy to identify due to its red stem and its rounded yellow petals, as well as the very distinct round seed capsule in the middle. That's kind of how I differentiated it from a couple of other species. So, fun fact about this plant is that it is named after botanist Christian Gottlieb Ludwig. This next species, I believe, is the common gallberry or inkberry. It does look very similar to several other berries, like berry shrubs. So I'm still not 100% on this identification, but I'm going to go with common gallberry. Its scientific name is Ilex glabra, and it is very common in pine flatwoods. And a fun fact about them is that they can either be born as single flowers or in cymes, which means they could be male or female. So this one stood out to me almost immediately when I entered the pine flatwoods. It is the vanilla leaf, or Carphophorus odoratissimus. So this one looked very, very similar to a lot of other species, which made it very difficult to identify. But looking at the stem, it's thin red stem with these very short, light green, alternately arranged leaves. And so that's how I differentiated it from a variety of other species. And a fun fact about the vanilla leaf is that it does have a very slight vanilla fragrance to it. I did not sniff it myself, but I'm sure that if I did, it would give off a slightly vanilla scent. My picture wasn't the best because he was in a tree right above me, and I was a little nervous to get too close to him. He was a pretty big spider. So this is what I had to work with, and you can visually see these black bands around their long, skinny legs. So I've determined that it is possibly a banded garden spider from the genus Argiope. And a fun fact about these guys is that their webs tend to be very strong and sticky in order to catch larger prey, such as wasps or bees. So this next flower is the shortleaf rose gentian, or Sebacia brevifolia. And this one was actually really easy to identify because the book I found it in looked almost identical to the photo that I took. So it was pretty easy to identify from its narrow white flowers and its greenish yellow center under its reproductive parts. And so a little fun fact is that they are very common in pine flatwoods specifically. And I also read somewhere that they can be used to treat malaria. So I probably spent half the time I was in the pine flatwoods looking for this guy. He is a brown-headed nuthatch, and his scientific name is Psittacilla. And so these guys are very tiny. They have these very loud songbird calls too. So I was following that, trying to find him for probably half an hour to 45 minutes. Just because I really wanted to find him. I was determined, and eventually I did. I didn't get the best photos, but I did see him through the binoculars, and he's got this this light brown top on his head, and this straight black beak, which is how I determined his species. But an interesting fact is that this bird species is the only North American songbird to use a tool while foraging. So they use pieces of bark to lift other pieces of bark and reveal insects. Now we've got the saw palmetto. So this one was a very easy identification because of the sharp teeth lining both sides of its petiole. And so these sharp teeth I was very tempted to touch, but lucky for me I didn't, because they can cut skin open like a quote-unquote saw. Scientific name is Serenoa repens. And a fun fact about these guys is that eastern diamondback rattlesnakes actually love to use them as shade. And if I saw one, I probably would have freaked out. but it also would have been really awesome to see one of these guys resting under a saw palmetto. So these next two species, I've got the Tenangle pipewort, scientific name Ericolin decangulare. So this guy looks like a little cotton ball on a stick. However, it is a tiny, tight cluster of little white flowers. And the name Ericolin actually means woolly stem. So if you look very closely, you can see little woolly hairs coming off of it. And on top of this guy, we've got the little metalmark. So this one I'm still a bit unsure about because a lot of metalmark butterflies look very similar to each other. So this species was as close as I could get. Scientific name is Calephilus virginiensis. So this guy has these rusty orange to orangish brown wings and metallic silver lines on them as well. And you can't really see from my photos, but there are little lines going down the wings. So last but not least, I've got the longleaf pine tree, or the Pinus palustris. I've got two different longleaf pine trees here. On the left, you can see a red-cockaded woodpecker cavity in the tree. And these birds typically tend to only prefer longleaf pine trees. So it was a little bit easy to ID this one just because of that. And then on the right, you've got one still in its growing stages, but it's pretty easy to tell that it is a longleaf pine due to its really long needles, and each cluster has 3 needles in it. And so if you zoomed in pretty well, you'd be able to see that cluster of 3. So a little fun fact about these guys, they create this very thick bark in order to protect from fire. They're adapted to fire in several different ways, and that is one of them. So that's going to conclude the Florida scrub and pine flatwoods for my first ID diary. These last species on this slide I didn't end up IDing, but I did want to include them. So here they are. Thanks for watching.